For the final class of the semester, students gathered in small groups to discuss America's role in the world from World War II to the present day. Sarah found herself acting as the moderator for her group's conversation. The United States emerged from World War II as a superpower, she began confidently. This new position brought both opportunities and responsibilities. The group discussed the Cold War, the civil rights movement, technological innovations, and globalization. Sarah noticed how comfortable she now felt expressing complex ideas in English, asking thoughtful questions, and even occasionally correcting her American classmates on historical details. When Professor Miller asked for final reflections, Sarah raised her hand. "When I arrived in this country 6 months ago," she said, "I was afraid to speak English around native speakers. But studying American history gave me more than facts and dates. It gave me context for understanding American culture and confidence in my language skills." She smiled at her classmates. History isn't just about the past. It helps us understand who we are today and imagine who we might become tomorrow. As Sarah walked across campus that afternoon, she felt a sense of accomplishment. Not only had her English improved dramatically, but she had gained a deeper appreciation for the complex, contradictory, and ultimately hopeful story of her host country. And in the process, she had become part of that ongoing American story herself. That evening, Sarah received an email from Professor Miller with an unexpected opportunity. The history department was organizing a summer program where students would travel across the country, visiting key historical sites from Plymouth Rock to Silicon Valley. They needed a student assistant to help coordinate the trip and blog about the experience. Would Sarah be interested? "This wasn't in my original plan," she told her roommate as she considered the offer. Her parents had expected her to return to Seoul after the spring semester. "But that's kind of the American story too, isn't it?" Her roommate replied. "Plans change. People adapt. New opportunities arise." Sarah smiled at the parallel. She called her parents that night and was surprised by their enthusiastic support. "You sound different," her father observed, more confident. The next morning, Sarah met Professor Miller in her office to accept the position. As they discussed the summer itinerary, Sarah realized how much her perspective had evolved. "When we visit the Vietnam Veterans Memorial," she suggested, "maybe we could arrange for students to hear from both veterans and anti-war activists. Understanding different viewpoints seems essential to learning history." Professor Miller nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of thinking we need. American history isn't one single narrative. It's many stories woven together, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in conflict." On the last day of finals week, Sarah joined her friends at a local cafe to celebrate. As they reminisced about their favorite moments from the semester, Darius asked what had surprised her most about American history. Sarah thought carefully before answering. "I think what surprised me most was discovering that learning history in a new language didn't just improve my English. It changed how I think about both countries. I see Korea differently now too, with new questions about our own historical narrative. That's what makes you a real historian," Marcus said, raising his coffee cup in a toast. Asking good questions is more important than memorizing answers. As the semester progressed, Sarah became increasingly comfortable with both American history and English conversation. For her midterm project, she created a presentation about America's transformation from an agricultural society to an industrial powerhouse. Between 1870 and 1970, she explained to her classmates, the United States underwent remarkable changes. Immigrants arrived from around the world, bringing diverse cultures, languages, and skills. Cities grew rapidly as factories provided new jobs. Sarah described how innovations like the transcontinental railroad, telephone, and assembly line changed daily life. She talked about the struggles of workers fighting for better conditions, women demanding the right to vote, and minority groups challenging discrimination. Professor Miller nodded approvingly when Sarah concluded, "During these 100 years, America experienced incredible growth, but also painful growing pains. The nation had to continually redefine what freedom and opportunity truly meant." After class, several students complimented Sarah's presentation. She realized that through studying history, Her English vocabulary had expanded tremendously. Words like industrialization, suffrage, and segregation now felt natural on her tongue. That weekend, Sarah visited Ellis Island with the History Club, standing in the Great Hall where millions of immigrants had once waited anxiously to be processed. She felt a powerful connection to the past. She thought about her own journey to America, so much easier than those who had come a century before. Did you know that many immigrants had their names changed here? Darius explained as they examined the displays. Officials would sometimes simplify or Americanize names they found difficult to pronounce. Sarah ran her fingers along the wall of names. I can understand that feeling, wondering if you'll have to change part of your identity to fit in. Marcus pointed to a black and white photograph showing crowded tenement housing. Most immigrants settled in ethnic neighborhoods in big cities like New York, Chicago, and Boston. They faced discrimination, but also built strong communities. As they toured the museum, Sarah found herself thinking about the parallels between the immigration experience and language learning. Both involved navigating between cultures, adapting while trying to preserve one's identity. On the ferry ride back to Manhattan, Sarah stood at the railing, watching the Statue of Liberty grow smaller in the distance. She thought about the workers' movements, the women's suffrage campaign, and the civil rights struggles she'd researched for her presentation. Somehow, seeing Ellis Island had made these historical movements feel more personal. You know, she said to Ling, who stood beside her, I used to think American history was just about presidents and wars. But it's really about all these different groups of people fighting to make the country live up to its ideals. Ling nodded. That's what makes it fascinating. The story isn't finished. Later that night, Sarah wrote in her journal, switching comfortably between Korean and English. She reflected on how studying this transformative century had transformed her own relationship with language. When she'd arrived in America, she'd been afraid of making mistakes. Now she understood that language, like history, was a messy, evolving process, full of contradictions, struggles, and unexpected beauty. The following week, Professor Miller organized a special lecture on the Great Depression and World War II. Sarah arrived early, securing a seat in the front row. As she waited, she reviewed her notes on the stock market crash of 1929, the New Deal programs, and America's entry into the war after Pearl Harbor. A guest speaker, Professor Emeritus James Wilson, began with personal stories from his parents who had lived through these tumultuous times. My father stood in bread lines during the Depression, he explained, his voice resonating with emotion. And my mother worked in a factory making aircraft parts during the war, one of the original Rosie the Riveters. Sarah found herself captivated not just by the historical facts, but by the human experiences behind them. She raised her hand during the question period, surprising herself with her confidence. How did ordinary Americans maintain hope during such difficult times? She asked. Professor Wilson smiled. That's precisely the question historians should ask. It wasn't just about policies and battles. It was about community resilience. People helped neighbors, shared what little they had, and found strength in unity. After the lecture, Sarah joined a small group gathered around Professor Wilson. As they discussed how the New Deal transformed American society and how World War II established America as a global superpower, she realized she was no longer translating in her head before speaking. 2 weeks later, Sarah joined her study group at the campus library. Together with her new friends, Marcus, Ling, and Darius, they prepared for their upcoming quiz on 19th century America. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 doubled the size of the young nation, Marcus explained, pointing to their shared map. President Jefferson bought this enormous territory from France for just $15 million. Sarah nodded, taking notes. And then Lewis and Clark explored it, right? Making detailed maps and recording information about plants, animals, and Native American tribes. Lang sighed. But this expansion came at a terrible cost to indigenous peoples. The group fell silent as they considered the painful contradictions in American history, a nation founded on freedom that simultaneously denied rights to so many. Their discussion turned to the growing tensions between North and South, the horrific reality of slavery, and how these divisions eventually led to civil war. Through their conversation, Sarah found herself using more complex English phrases to discuss these nuanced historical topics. What I find most interesting, Darius said, breaking the silence, is how Americans developed this concept of manifest destiny, this belief that they were destined to expand across the continent. Sarah tested the unfamiliar phrase on her tongue. Manifest destiny, she repeated carefully. Was this idea used to justify taking land from Mexico and Native American tribes? Exactly, Marcus confirmed. After the Mexican-American War ended in 1848, the United States gained California and the Southwest. Then came the gold rush of 1849, bringing thousands of settlers westward. Sarah opened her textbook to a photograph of pioneers traveling in covered wagons along the Oregon Trail. She thought about the courage it must have taken to journey into unknown territories, and the devastating impact on those who already called those lands home. Later that afternoon, the group moved their discussion outside, sitting beneath a large oak tree on the campus lawn. Darius brought coffee for everyone while Ling shared homemade cookies. The most difficult thing for me to understand, Sarah said, carefully choosing her words, is how the same America that produced the Declaration of Independence could also have slavery for so long. That's the central tension of American history, Marcus replied. Frederick Douglass, who escaped slavery and became an abolitionist, pointed out this hypocrisy in his famous speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July?" Sarah made a note to look up this speech later. Her English comprehension had improved enough that she could now read original historical documents, though sometimes with the help of a dictionary. As the autumn sun began to set, casting long shadows across the quad, the friends gathered their books. Their quiz was tomorrow, but Sarah knew their learning went far beyond memorizing dates and events. They were wrestling with complex moral questions about freedom, expansion, and justice. Questions that had shaped America and continue to resonate today. Walking back to her dormitory, Sarah recorded new vocabulary words on her phone. Abolition, secession, expansion, compromise. But more than just words, she was acquiring the language to understand a nation's painful growth, and her own growing confidence in navigating these complex conversations in English. Sarah sat at her desk, nervously awaiting her turn to present. As an exchange student from South Korea, she had worked diligently on her English skills, but speaking in front of the American history class still made her anxious. Her topic was the founding of the United States, a subject she found both complex and fascinating. When Professor Miller called her name, Sarah took a deep breath and stood. She began to tell the story of the 13 colonies and their struggle against British rule. As she spoke about the Declaration of Independence, signed in 1776, she noticed her classmates leaning forward, engaged by her careful pronunciation and thoughtful insights. The Founding Fathers risked everything, Sarah explained, gaining confidence with each word. They believed in liberty and justice for all, even though these ideals would take generations to fully realize. By the time she finished describing the Revolutionary War and George Washington's leadership, Sarah realized something important. She wasn't just learning English vocabulary, she was connecting with American culture in a meaningful way. After class, Professor Miller approached Sarah with a warm smile. "That was excellent work. I especially appreciated how you explained the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Sarah felt a rush of pride. She had spent hours practicing those difficult historical terms: federalism, checks and balances, compromise. Her roommate had patiently listened as she rehearsed explaining how the Founding Fathers debated representation and power. "Thank you," she replied. "I find it fascinating how they created a system where power is divided between different branches of government." "You know," Professor Miller said, "many of my American students don't grasp how revolutionary these concepts were for their time. Would you be interested in joining our history club? We're planning a trip to Philadelphia to see Independence Hall next month." Sarah hesitated only briefly before nodding. 6 months ago, she would have declined, afraid her English wasn't good enough for casual conversation with native speakers. But something had changed. That evening, Sarah called her parents in Seoul. "You won't believe what happened today," she said in Korean, before switching to English to explain the historical terms she'd mastered. Her mother laughed with delight at hearing her daughter's growing confidence. Later, as Sarah reviewed her notes for tomorrow's discussion on the Bill of Rights, she found herself thinking about freedom in her own context. The First Amendment protections of speech, religion, and assembly weren't just historical facts to memorize. They were living principles that shaped the classroom she sat in every day. She opened her laptop and began writing in her journal. Today I realized that learning a new language isn't just about grammar and vocabulary. It's about understanding the ideas and values that shape how people think. When I discuss American history in English, I'm not just translating words. I'm stepping into a different way of seeing the world. Sarah smiled as she wrote, no longer merely an observer of American history, but a participant in its ongoing conversation.